Time has gone by, now is here back with us in Recanati, and I am sure, I'm confident it will be extremely interesting for everybody to listen to his speech. We know that he's been a protagonist of the debate on architecture and design at international level, so we are actually very happy to have students here, to have architects, to have all the theorists of the beauty, of the modernity, in order to listen to him, in order to meditate, let's say, on what kind of architecture we should propose and realize in our territory, offering to our people. As you know, Mr. Eisenman has been a very significant protagonist. I know Pippo Ciorra will follow after my short presentation and introduction. So, first of all, the Holocaust in Berlin, the Jewish Museum. If you have been in Berlin, I hope you will take a trip, and I'm sure you will be touched. It's very emotional, a very emotional building, a very emotional project, a very special monument, a sign of what happened in the past that should, of course, never happen again in the future. So this is the first LightOn in Recanati. In the previous one, we met at Maxi in Rome because of technical reasons, so we apologize, but actually this is part of our schedule. Sometimes it's not very easy to stay with the schedule, especially talking about big names like Peter Eisenman, so we were able to change the schedule in a very flexible way. The next we will have Mr. Jingan, the next LightOn at the end of October, and we will continue our tradition with LightOn conferences for our region, for Le Marche region. I know that we have some Spanish colleagues here with us today. They are here for different reasons, but they are happy to listen to this speech. As a company, we believe that it's important to give our territory something back, because the territory has been very important for us. So we want to give a kind of a gift to the people working around us. People like Peter Eisenman, they are, you know, the best people, let's say, in the field, in the industry. So this will be a great opportunity for everybody to be together, to listen to him, and to get to know his work. I will now, after my very brief salutation, I will now leave the floor to Pippo Ciorra. But, you know, Peter Eisenman speaks Italian very good. He likes Italian teams, Barcelona, so actually we had lunch together and we spent some time together during lunch, and of course we spoke about our professions and so on, but we also told him the story, let's say our history, in order to see the importance for football. Also because football is a very important activity for young people. Our industrial group has decided to adopt a school in Recanati. It is a technical school, a vocational school. It was about to close, and we decided to step in, and we decided to support this technical vocational school because it was very important for us in terms of staff. So we are a manufacturing region, so at that time I proposed my family, my brothers, to support the technical school in order to keep it open. I would say that our human resources, we are always committed to find people who could support our sponsorship with this school. So again, we found about 500 people students at that time. Now they have almost 900. So this school has become the most important technical vocational school in the Marche region. On the other side, a few years ago, always thinking about the young people, our human resources department, they keep the relations with university and schools. So talking about a young football team and also a young tennis club. There is a tennis club, an important tennis club in Recanati. So we used the name of the school as a sponsor for the football team, for the tennis club. So we have a football team. It is a federal center. We have a very important, as I said before, tennis club. We have very important players under 14 years old. So they are promoting the name of our schools. So this link between the vocational school, between sports, between young people, we have to train our young people, because education, because schools and university and sports as well, they all guarantee great experiences for the young people. So again, this is our action, what we do in order to support families and in order to support the young people. So we have a champion here. Let's say we have a champion in terms of cultural issues. We have a champion in terms of theories. So we have been playing around a little bit, and Peter is interested in football, as I said before, and for example, we have other initiatives. For example, even in China, we have had some training activities going on with China, so with schools and so on. So this is, again, a very important field of activity for us. So, as a gift, Peter, I would like to offer you, if you can please join us. I have the obligation, because we have to take a picture, of course. So, first of all, this is the flag, let's say. It's the Recanati football team, established in 1923. Of course, you are an honor member starting from now. Mr. Camilletti will take note as department, as chief of the human resources. And then this is your shirt. This is your Recanati football team shirt. And also, okay, now this is the scarf, and it says, these are the lions of Recanati. You know, the lion is the symbol of Recanati. So again, Peter, this is a great honor for us, a great pleasure to have you here, and thank you for being such a nice person. I will now let Pippo Ciorra introduce you. It's not easy for me because of three reasons. First of all, he understands Italian, so he knows what I'm saying. The second is a long story that it's not easy for me to choose the information that might be useful for you, and I don't want to delay his speech. And Peter is like a guide for us. So it's not easy to frame, let's say, his work in a very short presentation. Peter Eisenman is important for architecture and is also very important for Italy. Eisenman, I will now just list the things why you have to pay great attention to you. Peter Eisenman came to Italy, first of all, I would say in 1961. In 61, he came together with Colin Rowe, another very important architect, and he fell in love, so to say, especially with contemporary architecture and the historical architecture of our country, and he has been focusing on it. And then he came back to Italy in 1973 for Aldo Rossi exhibition, and he started to have a very important exchange, let's say, with Aldo Rossi, Tafuri, and he built a kind of a window in America on Italian architecture, and this window became a very important channel of exchange. So it has been, quite common for us to see Peter wandering around the streets, the alleys in Venice, as well as the same way we saw Aldo Rossi and Tafuri in New York. He actually created two very important institutions: the Institute for Architectural and Urban Studies, opened in New York from 67 to 84, and in about 74, 75 it became a school where our maestros, let's say, went to tell about Italy, and then Cooper Union in New York, Oppositions, a very important magazine, and it became the voice of Italian architecture in Italy. So the first reason for me is this exchange between learning and teaching, exchanging meanings with Italian architecture according to a very important interpretation. Peter has understood Italian architecture as soon, right away. When he took a trip in 61, he was traveling with Colin Rowe. Colin Rowe was maybe his most important professors at the time, and he had understood that modernism was a combination of political, historical, technical meanings and a language. And the relation, as everybody knows, between the language and the contents were not so strict. Colin used to call it manierism, but anyway, it taught us that Terragni could be an important architect, although he was fascist, and even Libera, the fascist house, was not going to be read just through politics, but through architecture. So Eisenman has developed the approach from Colin Rowe, and he has taught us how to look at our history of architecture with free eyes. So Libera, Le Corbusier and Terragni, they all worked according to a language, and the language corresponded to a shape. So this is a very first portion of Eisenman's role. Then he participated in very important turning points in architecture. I would say that for 3 times, in 32, for example, 1932, there was an exhibition on Philip Johnson International Style, and then in 69, for the first time, they organized an exhibition about the five architects, and Peter was one of them, together with Richard Meyer and Gwathmey and Graves and Hajduk, the 5 architects of New York. And then in 1988, with a famous exhibition on deconstructionism. So Eisenman was always, let's say, 2 out of 3 he was there, so is extremely important, also, on a mathematical way. So in the 1960s, they created a group. It was not a real group, but there was a book and an exhibition, and Colin Rowe and Franton, they started to write about the 5 architects, the white architects that were using Terragni and Le Corbusier language to build. And the book is very interesting because the catalog actually has a preview of Colin Rowe, and in Italy it is published with a preface from Tafuri, so there is always a great exchange. In the 1960s, Eisenman re-edited the vision about modernism, and in 1970s, when time had already, let's say, digested the problems and the criticalities about modernism, he has started to deconstruct modernism in order to make people understand the importance of language, the value of language, architecture as a second language. So from there we started to understand the potential of language and how architecture can communicate a lot of things while you plan and design an architectural building. Can be, you know, our thoughts about the world, about politics, about everything we want. So what I have understood about Eisenman, I'm not sure about, you know, I have not understood him fully, but in Cannaregio in Venice, he carried out a very important investigation project, I think 1978 in Venice, in Cannaregio district, in order to convert. There is a great square, a large square in this part of town. It's a project that actually takes from the hospital, from Le Corbusier, and he started to build a series of elements that started to be superimposed on the existing structures as a grid. So I started to understand the great and strict relation between man and history and architecture. So he was actually building a relation with something that was not there. And so Venice, again, the connection between Venice and New York, extremely, very, very interesting. Eisenman is a very important theorist. Many books, and there is a collection of books being published by our friend Manuel from our region, so this is the publishing company, and he is also, Tafuri one day he said, if you do not build buildings, nobody will take you seriously. So Eisenman has built very important buildings. One of the most famous is in Berlin. We said Charles Point, checkpoint. Actually, that was the point between the East and the West. And then he built a museum in a faculty where I was at the time teaching, and that was the same time as the MoMA, a very special building in order to understand Eisenman's work. He also built a special museum complex in Santiago de Compostela, which is a kind of a transition in his architectural work. And also, he also built a masterpiece, a total masterpiece, which is the monument to the victims of Holocaust in Berlin. You know, landscape art, architecture, sculpture, history. Well, you know, it's a very complex work that contains the entire vision of Eisenman. Eisenman is building in Italy. There is a building in Milan being created according to his project. Of course, I could, you know, say a lot of different things, but I do not want to take the pleasure of listening. I think Eisenman is extremely good in giving lectures and giving speeches, so he can communicate his thoughts. So we're happy he can now wear the Recanati t-shirt from the football team.
Thank you, people. Thank you to Signora Gwathmey and all the others. I always love speaking in Italy because I think Italians understand more what I'm saying than Americans, but that's another story. I have about 3 or 4 beginnings. You mentioned the Holocaust Memorial. I'm really excited that the new right, the extreme right, the Alternative for Deutschland, one of their main programs is to get rid of my memorial. And for those of you who think that architecture is not political, you should read about what they think about my memorial. So I'm really excited that they don't like the memorial. That means it's very political. And I've never had anybody be interested in the politics of my work. So that's number one. Number two, when I came to Italy first in '61, and I came upon the Casa del Fascio in Como, As Colin Rose said, I had an epiphany. I had an experience of something that I had never seen before. And I still believe to this day, some 55, 56 years later, that the Casa del Fascio is something other than Le Corbusier, other than Mies van der Rohe, other than Frank Lloyd Wright, other than Adolf Loos, and something that's very important to understanding why I'm here tonight. It has to do with a term that I'm going to speak of tonight called close reading, and the political implications of close reading. Number 3 point that I want to make at the start, we were invited last week to Zurich to the ETH, the 50th anniversary of their History and Theory Institute, and the title of the program that I was on was, "Is This the End of Theory?" And I spoke with Kurt Forster, the moderator, and Jacques Herzog as one of the components, and myself as the other. Anytime that I see a title, "Is this the end of theory?" I get very worried about architecture, because to me, architecture is theory. Building may not be, but building and architecture are something very different. Design and architecture are something different. And I'm going to try and talk about those things tonight. But to me, theory is architecture, not in architecture, of architecture. It is architecture. And so the end of theory might mean the end of architecture. And I don't think that's culturally possible. I don't know why, after thousands of years, architecture would suddenly come to an end. So I'm not too worried about that. I want to say that the architecture that we know comes down to us from an Italian architect, Leone Battista Alberti. And Alberti wrote in the 15th century a book called De Re Edificatoria. I wouldn't advise any of you to read it. I don't even assign it to my students, because actually it's very boring. It's hundreds of pages of, this is how you lay bricks, this is how you lay stones, this is how you construct a foundation, etc. It's a how-to manual of architecture. But there are some very important theoretical points that are made by Alberti, and that's why we see him as the father, perhaps, of modern architecture, and certainly an architecture that is theoretical. And he set the groundwork for thinking about architecture. One of the terms that Alberti put forward in this book was the Latin term consinitas. And consinitas has, I'm not a Latin scholar, so I only interpret it the way I want, has something to do with a fitting relationship, things that work together. And Alberti later on in this manuscript says that a city is a large house and a house is a small city, so that there is a relationship of scale between the part, the house, and the whole, the city. That relationship has lasted until today. It is one of the most important things that if you're a student, as some of you are, and your teacher says, well, how does this building relate to the site? How does this site relate to the rest of the city? How does the living quarters relate to the office quarters? Any number of relational things are always asking the student why he or she does something in a certain way. That idea of a relationship is something that I call an ideality, that it is the ideal dimension of architecture that spurs architecture. That is, we think we're doing right or ethically, morally good if parts relate to wholes. The interesting thing is that that kind of architecture becomes important politically. In other words, and this is where politics enters into architecture, that architecture becomes useful when the parts relate to the whole. In other words, when it's an easily understood and seen relationship that political power uses architecture. What I'm going to say is that what modern architecture was about something that was against this idealism. That is, it was something that said the world is very much more complicated, it's very much more fragmented, it's no longer parts in relation to whole, this is something that modern architecture was attempting to do politically and philosophically. It didn't achieve this, I believe, because of the ideality of the Albertian dictum of the parts must relate to the whole. My students to this day are still trying to design things that relate to the whole. Therefore, we get to the word close reading. Close reading in architecture, it's a way of damming up, of stopping the easy relationship of architecture to politics that make it difficult for politics to desire architecture. An example, when you go to Venezia, where are all the tourists? They're in the Piazza San Marco taking photographs, selfies, photographing pigeons, whatever. But none of them ever look at the great architecture, which is San Giorgio Maggiore or Re Torre. No tourists in front of Palladio's two great churches. Why is that? Because architecture, and architecture that requires close reading, is not something that tourists are interested in. They want the quick, the easy, etc. And so what I found out when I was on my first trip to Italy in '61, when I saw the Casa del Fascio, I realized there was something about this building, as I said, that Le Corbusier didn't do, couldn't do, etc., because he didn't come from this particular culture which supported the idea of close reading. I just took my students this past week. My students were with me, and we went to Siena, we went to Montepulciano. I hadn't been to Montepulciano in 50 years since I was with Colin Rowe. We went to see the church by San Gallo. We went to see the Palazzo Tarugi by Vignola. These are still things that resonate in my understanding and my thinking and my teaching as important. It is the culture of these things that I understood, perhaps not very clearly, in 1961 that was going to be important for the rest of my life. And that is that there was a reason that these things were important, that they were demanded, whether it's Redentore or San Giorgio or Santa Maria della Pace in Rome, of Bramante, or any of these things that are part of your culture that required something more than a quick look. They were not able to be a tweet. 140 characters would not explain the Casa del Fascio, or the Palazzo Tarugi. And when I discovered this, I discovered another power. And Jeff Kipnis, my colleague and friend from Ohio State, wrote about this in the last, a book called By Other Means, where he said that Peter Eisenman discovered in Europe and at Cambridge in '61 that there was another power other than design. Not that you didn't have to design or build, but that there was another power involved in architecture, and that was thinking. And I don't believe that there is architecture without theory or theory without architecture. Manfredo Tafuri also said to me once, as people said, that Peter, no one will care about what you think unless you build. I want to add to that, unless you build ideas, no one will care what you build. How do you build ideas? How do you build close reading? And so the idea today that I'm going to do is to show you a building that is about to be built in Istanbul, Turkey. It's a museum that we won a competition for, and we enter competitions. As a matter of fact, I would argue that the only buildings of ours that are architecture were won by competition, because what you win when you're dealing with a competition is ideas. And if these are not the ideas of the client, they're the ideas about architecture of architecture. And so we won the project. It's called the Yenikapı Museum Project. It's something that we finished the construction documents about 2 or 3 months ago, and we're working, and there's a hole in the ground ready for us. All we need to do is the authorization of the municipality. Now, I'm not going to argue for the politics of Turkey. I'm not going to argue for the politics of Erdogan. I always seem to build for people, for clients who are slightly right of center. When we built and won the project in Spain, the minister, the president of the region of Galicia, Manuel Fraga Irabani, was the last fascist minister in Spain, but he was a wonderful man who understood contemporary culture, and he understood that to build a cultural center in Galicia was something very important to perhaps atone for the years of fascism in Italy. I think also that if we build this project in Turkey, which it looks like we will, it will be built in spite of the political right that is operating. And so I think it works both ways. One, the right in Germany is trying to tear down our projects, and the other, the right in Spain and Istanbul and Turkey, are trying to build up our projects. So I think we're caught in the middle of politics, but we have to recognize that politics is always at work. And I think it's important that we make a statement that architecture is always, in addition to its cultural and social ambitions, its aesthetic ambitions, it is also operating with and against politics. And I think one realizes that because theoretical propositions become political, for sure. Okay, with that said, I'm going to show you a project, the Yenikapı Museum project, which requires close reading. You're going to say, why does it look like this? It looks like this because it requires that It's not just a big box. It's not just a one-liner. There are many lines that are going to be involved in the project. And I think it's worth walking you through how we got that way and where we are now. So with that in mind, let's begin. Can we turn the lights out and we turn on the slides? So the title of my talk is A Theory of the Present. The subtitle would be Close Reading Architecture. Okay. We were given a site here in Istanbul. The major mosques are over here about a kilometer away, the Blue Mosque, Hagia Sophia, etc. This is the waterfront to the Sea of Marmara. The Bosphorus would be over here. This is a nondescript area, but a major railroad station connecting Asia with Europe. The Orient Express, for example, used to stop in Istanbul. You had to take a boat across to the Asian side and then get on another train. Now, because of this station and the tunnel under here, you can, in fact, stay on the train all the way through to the eastern edge of the Soviet Union. So this was the form of the station. And because there were excavations here, in excavating for this station, the authorities found 36 boats intact, prehistoric boats before the 5th and 6th centuries in Istanbul they never thought existed. And so they didn't know what to do with these artifacts. There were quite a number of them. And so they said, let's have a competition for this site here, and we'll make it an archaeological museum. And so we entered that competition with a young Turkish architect, and we were lucky to win the competition, and then been asked to go forward to build the project. We started with a theoretical idea that there was in this site what one would Roman call a cardo and decumanus. Here is the cardo and here is the decumanus of the area. And we were given this site here, just north, as it were, west and north of the railroad station. And there was a hole here, which they said, now it's the size of your project, so go ahead. And this is where our project began. We started to think about the shoreline and the waterline of the Sea of Marmara as an idea. And this was when, in the early Constantinople, the original shoreline. And then you begin to see the white, the red, and the yellow, other shorelines that happened in the history, the centuries, maybe 8 centuries of growth to where the water line now is out here. But these lines were represented city walls, and also they, in fact, because they intersect our site at various times, became an important historical idea of the site. So what we did was to think about, here is the station here. This was a competition model that we made. This is not the way the project came out, but it had along this city wall here, the edge of our project, and we had a certain zoning requirement to stay north of this line here. This was the train station. And so we were given this site here plus this and said this would be the museum. Now it's a very long linear project. And after much negotiation, we decided that this would be the project that would, for visitors, and this would be the research project. We had originally had them together, but this was going to be the open museum, and this was going to be the closed museum, and this was going to be a future archaeological site. That is, so that the archaeologists who still feel there's material here, much material, could use this as both research in this part of the building and this as the field of exploration. You can see some of the deployment of ideas. This was the garden that we would make between the station and our project. These were some of the overall gridded moves that would animate the work as we move toward realization. This is a Peter Eisenman drawing, just to show you that I draw. I don't use a computer, and to me, drawing is still very important. I want my students always to draw. I asked them to draw the plan of one of the churches we were at. I wanted them to draw the facade of Palazzo Toruggi. And so to me, drawing and the history of the Renaissance, especially in northern Italy, which is something that in addition to design, I have a course that starts with Brunelleschi, goes to Alberti, Bramante, Peruzzi, Palladio Vignola, Borromini, Rinaldi, Piranesi. That's the run that we do in a first-year course, and the students every week have to draw a plan so that they become alert to the kinds of ideas that are evolving in the Italian Renaissance. Let's see, from the beginning of humanism in Brunelleschi to the beginning of the Enlightenment in Piranesi. Again, one of the animating devices that we use is always to look at existing fabric. In this case, we were looking at the Great Mosque, and what we found in the mosque was this grid here, a very unique grid, which is unlike anything we could find as a grid in Western architecture. And so we took this particular grid and blew it up to this dimension as an idea. And the whole building now, the full length of the building, becomes the animated grid of Hagia Sophia, a grid that in this scale you wouldn't recognize as Hagia Sophia, but it comes out of that organization. So we took the exact same Hagia Sophia grid and multiplied it any number of times at any number of larger scale, and you'll see at smaller scales. So that already we have placed within a project something that is unrecognizable as modern or postmodern or neoclassical, but comes out of Hagia Sophia. And it's unrecognizable because of the many scales that we use it in. And here you can see another of the drawings. And these are drawings to try and find out, we're not talking about whether the exhibitions work, whether the scale of the project works, where people go and come. It's an idea about architecture, and it's an idea about the culture of architecture and how we deploy that culture today so that it's neither modern nor postmodern, it's not nostalgia, but it's something that is active in the being of Hagia Sophia, one of the great works in Istanbul, and we take it as emblematically and project it, as it were, onto the project. Just make sure. So this is the whole length of the building, and at different scales, this grid is going to operate. And we looked at the topography of the ground and what was the natural topography in the hole that we were given, what was there as a series of layers, horizontal layers. So we had the grid operating in a vertical dimension, and we had the horizontal layers of the different soils operating from the hole that we dug. So it's both this kind of natural topography and the Hagia Sophia grid overlaid onto each other that produce an elevation like this. Is it good? Is it bad? Does it matter? What does it look like? I don't know. But I do know that it comes out of both the natural layering of the topography and the Hagia Sophia grid. So you have different calibrations of D, E, A, B, D, E, A, B. Now, DEAB is not a calibration of a regular organizational grid. It's something that comes out of Hagia Sophia, and we use it to produce this organization, which requires something more than a Cartesian grid, a 9-square grid, a Roman grid, etc., that we found in Hagia Sophia. And there you can see the horizontal layers up above put onto the Hagia Sophia grid, and you get something like this. And there is the footprint of the site that has been excavated for us. So this is, we place this material, the vertical material and the horizontal material, back in to fill up the site. We're limited to 34 meters in height by the surrounding religious structures, so that there is no building that could be above 34 meters, so it's a horizontal building. And then we have a contemporary model of what I just showed you. And we make lots of different models. This is a horizontal model of the horizontal layers, and then there'll be vertical models. But they're all, in a sense, to study both the horizontal and vertical sections of the project. This in front is the This is the railroad station. It serves 1 million people a day come in and out of this railroad station. So there's a lot of open space that's required to move people from here through the filter of the museum to the business and living community to the west. And of course, the Sea of Marmara is to the south, and there are local train connections. There are three rail connections that meet in this station. These are plans that show you the way we organize both the structural system, and of course it's a very complex structural system that we needed to get large-scale spaces for the boats, for 36 boats. We needed a restaurant, offices, all kinds of communitarian facilities, plus the organization of the exhibitions, and that's a whole other part of the work within the structure that we had set up. And then we decided to build a series of vertical models in chipboard, and this is the whole building sliced up so that we could look at sections of the project and to see how the sections, there's not one section that's the same as the next because of the way both the topography of the land plus the grid of the Hagia Sophia. There's this discontinuity. The parts don't relate to the whole. And of course, that was an objective of citing Alberti at the beginning, that we were trying to overcome the Albertian dictum of the parts relating to the whole. These parts don't create a whole, they create something else. And then you get a chance to study both structurally, environmentally, how you air condition, how you catch light, how you move people, and you begin to see different scales of spaces in the museum, and each chunk, that is each horizontal slice, gives you a different spatial feeling, which was something that we were after. And so you learn a lot when you build models like this, but both taken from the front to understand what the facade and back, and the end facade. This is one end, this is the northern end, and the way you get down from the street to the ground level of the project, and then several of the sections. And I can tell you that engineering-wise, this was a very difficult section. How you bring this load down to the ground was very difficult to engineer. Why we insisted on this particular arrangement, I cannot tell you. I just think it happened. Things happen in the process that you can't explain, and the engineer would say, well, you know, there's another way to do this. And every time we saw what the engineer wanted to do, we said, let's do it this way. And this is what's so interesting about this project for us, is that when you, whatever that means. And so what's been amazing about this project, we never knew what the budget was. Nobody would tell us what the budget was. And so therefore, when we got done with the working drawings, and they're sort of 600 pages of working drawings of architecture. I mean, it's crazy, the kind of work that we were doing. but there was no value engineering. And I suppose the client wouldn't know where to start because there was so much of architectural drawing that they didn't know what the budget was to begin with. And we still don't know what it is, and things seem to be moving forward. I could come back 2 years from now and tell you there was another story, but right now we're excited about building. And then we get also in these models many different interior views. I don't believe in drawings on computers, that is perspectives and things like that. I really need physical models to see what the spaces are like. But of course, we want renderings, and the client does too. So here are some of the renderings that we made for the project. It gives you some idea. It's a big building, and it needs to be broken down in many of the ways that we tried to do that in terms of scale without recreating the whole in the part. Some of the interiors. Okay. What does it do to, I mean, I can't get up here and say, this is the way you should do architecture, because I'm not sure there is a way to do architecture. But I think it's important to try and understand the general theoretical matrix that all of us are operating under, and that is a Renaissance idea, an ideality which makes it increasingly interesting to clients, etc., and that the part relates to the whole. And so the theoretical promise that I'm bringing to you is to suggest that the critique of that idea becomes, for me, what I would call a theory of the present. Thank you very much. We will certainly have some questions, and I know that in most of these audiences, everybody wants to take pictures or etc. We can do that or sign books or whatever, but let's finish with the questions, and then the selfies can be later. And books, I said books. Oh, wait a minute. We'll sit down with Pete. Yeah.
Allora, Peter, first of all, thank you. Thank you very much for clarity, sharpness, and for showing a new project.
Eisenman will answer questions.
There's so many things to ask. Ci sono un sacco di cose che sono sicuro che volete chiedere. No, I mean, your project is, I know very well Istanbul. I love Istanbul. Your project is at the same time a view on the future of the city, and somehow like una spremuta, no? Like a concentrated reflection on your own legacy. So what do you think, on the base of this, what do you think the future of architecture can be? What is this bringing to the future of architecture?
You see, this is a question that everybody seems to be worried about today. What is the future? I think the future is tied to what is the future of the political world that we know. That is late capital democracy, etc. And if we say, what is the future of the political system in Italy? Is the same as the political problem in Britain with Brexit. It's the same as the one that we have in our country. And I think that architecture as a cultural, it's a necessity. It is every culture that we've ever had in the Western world, and we're now not just talking about the Western world, but every culture has explained itself and left artifacts for the future, let's say. I don't think that my building speaks of tomorrow. It speaks of, is it possible today in a declining democratic, and certainly in a certain way the declining democratic nature of the United States and Turkey are ultimately linked. Can you build architecture? And I would like to say that it's I'm really excited about building it, as more excited about building it than, say, having the right in Germany want to tear down the memorial. I think it's significant because the scale, it's 445,000 square meters. It's a big building.
A lot of value.
You know, and the fact that we are ready to build is the fact that it represents something in the culture that's very important, that it's still important in a declining social and economic situation, that we can still build cultural artifacts. And so I think that to me, that I don't see it as a resume of me. I mean, you. I don't like to think that way. You know, 100 years in 100 years there'll be a resume of me. You know, etc. But right now, getting to do something like of this scale is really important. You know, we're building a project in Milano. It's entirely different as an artifact, but you know, it has certain of the same qualities. It's for a condominium, residential condominium. There's another project that we may be doing in Turkey. There's a project that we've been working on in New Haven, Connecticut. There are any number of projects that require different approaches. And I think it's possible to, in this world, or even necessary, to produce building architecture that is theoretical.
I thank you. Very, very clear, maybe. I can put it worse if you want. I mean, this relationship between architecture and democracy is, of course, an obsession for all of us. In some cases, we may think that this declining condition of democracy, is it good or bad for architecture? Some of your colleagues have been like gambling a lot on this, working in countries where democracy is a little bit an ambiguous concept, like China, like the Middle East country. It is interesting that Eisenman you worked in Tokyo many years ago in a way that we all loved, but there's not been much of Eisenman you've not been investing so much in working in places like China or Taiwan or Middle East. Is there a reason for this?
It's too far. No, I mean, the joy of travel, which used to be wonderful 50 years ago, to come to Italy and be able to park your car outside the Palazzo Tarugi instead of, 10 kilometers below and I can't walk up those places anymore. To me, the world of travel has changed. Take your belt off, take your sneakers off, take your jacket off, put this on. They threw my toothpaste away. I thought I have a little thing of toothpaste. And, can we see that? It isn't, no matter how much you want to travel, it's a nightmare, I think. And I'm not interested. I was asked to go to China for the 100th anniversary of the big university in Shanghai. And they said, we want you to speak with Wang Chu, the Pulitzer Prize guy. And I said, hey, 16 hours over, 60, lots of money. But I said, if they threw in a building, maybe, right? But just to go over to be with, I said, I'll do it through Skype. And anyway, we have friends, really good friends in big offices in New York. The guy is away all the time. I mean, he's out, this client. You have a big office of 200 people, you've got to have maybe 30 clients, you got to see them once a month, right? So you're never working, you're always seeing clients. So anyway, it's choices you make. I didn't say this, but I believe to be an architect means to build, to think, that is to write, lecture, etc., and to teach. And I do all three of those things, and therefore I'm very lucky to be able to do that. I have great students. I learn a lot from my students. I have great people working in the office who are former students. We get work. I mean, what's so interesting, people, is that the projects that we have right now are all the result of former students calling me up and saying, hey, do you want to do this, right? And I think that's great. And the more students who have appreciated over time the time that we've had together, the more projects I get to do. So I
think it was a mistake on my side not to speak about the teaching side of your commitment, which is extremely important. In 2 years is 100 years from the Bauhaus.
Yes.
So do you think is it possible to have, I mean, is there anything like experimental teaching today?
First of all, I am not an experimental teacher, for sure.
I wasn't
right?
asking. That's why I asked you.
We were with a teacher last night. I don't remember the exact circumstances, with Pier Vittorio Reilly, an Italian who teaches at the AA. And Pier Vittorio was saying, they were asking our students to read Peter Sloterdijk. Now, first of all, that's also a big problem, you know, etc. And he said, shouldn't they learn how to read architecture or have read architecture before they read Peter Sloterdijk? And I couldn't agree more. And if they haven't read Le Corbusier, or if they haven't read, no matter how boring, Alberti, and if they haven't read Palladio, then they have to read these things. They have to read Bob Venturi's book. They have to read Aldo Rossi's book. They have to read Tafuri's book. They have to read Colin Rowe's book. There's a whole list of books that they need to read as part of their own culture before they read Peter Sloterdijk, for God's sake, right? If they never read Peter Sloterdijk, it won't matter. But if they don't read Manfredo Tafuri, that's a problem.
Or Peter Eisenman.
I never assign my books. I never assign reading in my own books. But we're going.
You are in our reading.
Thank you. No, but I'm speaking to the students here. There's an idea that architecture is dead, and there's all kinds of branding, design, designing apps for or whatever, computer games. And I think architecture is still an amazing cultural discourse that's very important to all of us. And if you don't have the discipline, if you don't know what architecture is, there's no point in reading Peter Sloterdijk, because he ain't going to help you.
I totally agree. Do you, a very Italian question, there's very much around the architecture world, maybe it was also because of you, but there's very much this kind of vague, misty nostalgia about the 60s and the 70s, the Italian legacy. What's your point of view of that? Which makes me very worried, but what's your point of view?
I don't think you should be, because there are moments in history. For example, if we're in Berlin, Germany, the best 10 years in Berlin, Germany was 23 to 33. It was fantastic there in the 20th century, okay? I have to say that in New York, from 68 to 78 was incredible. You couldn't do what happened there in film, in architecture, in painting, in literature. You couldn't do in performance what happened then and pay for it today. It couldn't happen. I'm not being nostalgic. It was a time of excitement. And there are periods of 10 years in cultural places where there is that possibility for excitement. Where that's going to be in, let's say, 10 years from now, I can't say. I think that there are, young people, first of all, are more equipped than we ever were as young people. We didn't know what the hell we were doing. We weren't aware of those things. And I don't think the Bauhaus was either. I don't think the sculptors and painters, I don't think the filmmakers in Italy like Antonioni or Bertolucci or Bellocchio were thinking we're really doing something, but they're not doing it today. Okay. The German filmmakers or the French filmmakers are not doing it today. It's quite obvious there was a golden age of films that you had to see. As there were golden ages in the history of Italian culture where architecture was important, where literature was important, where politics was important, and that ebb and flow. But I don't think it's a question of nostalgia. I think it's a question of cultural fact. Where those things are going to happen today and how they're going to happen because of the global culture that we have, the internet. I mean, Cynthia was saying to me yesterday as we were driving the bus in the Tuscan countryside, and there was a woman there walking quietly by herself with nothing around, not even an animal, with a cell phone, right? And she was in contact with the world. So being in contact with the world is, and maybe it's too much information, I mean, we went into a place yesterday, I forget where all the students put on their headphones, and of course I've never put a headphone on in a palazzo. I think just look at the damn thing and don't listen, because we're so keyed to information, and I think we have to be mindful of that. How do we experience reality? How do we deal with framing, forming, making space, which does make and form reality today? That's a really interesting question. And how architecture does that is also interesting.
I do agree with you, although, I do not agree. I do think that some of us use that memory as like branding nostalgia, which is something which is very worrying for me anyway. But Luca, Manuel, who wants to ask questions?
Hello, I'm Pier Andre, and first of all, I'd like to thank Mr. Eisenman and iGuzzini for this lecture. This is absolutely great. My question is, in the light of climate change, how do you include environmental issues in your architectural language?
I have to be really, really careful about this. So I will quote the professor at the university that I'm at, who is in charge of environmental issues. A full professor trained to deal with climatology, all kinds of environmental issues that she said, because I said, listen, you're going to have to write a section for me in this competition. How are we dealing with And she says, Peter, there are no formal implications to good climate control. There are none. She said, you can do whatever you want in terms of form as long as you're mindful of what the implications are for climate. So to be honest with you, I don't see yet the implications for architecture. I mean, yes, you can build in stone or wood instead of in whatever, but I don't see environmental conditions as leading to form. They are one of the factors, as are structural factors, light, safety, any number of issues that you have to put together to make a program for a building. It's one of them, but I don't think it's one above any of the others, just like structure is not one or any others, or safety, you know. So I would argue it's just one of the many factual considerations that we as architects must deal with, but we cannot design them away, I don't believe. Sure, if you're in a hurricane zone, you have to reinforce the project. If you are in you know, situations where temperature is a concern, rising temperature, you have to do everything you can to mediate against external risings of etc. But these don't necessarily in any way conflict with making architecture. I don't think. It's just another one of the concerns that we need to deal with.
But penso, I say it in English so you can check if I say it right. I mean, I think Peter Eisenman was able, along his career, to stress architecture in all its possible components, the language, the meanings, the philosophy, the science, but he was always able to keep architecture at the center of the game. Per cui io condivido, cioè tutti siamo interessati alle implicazioni tecniche, climatologiche dei nostri edifici. Tutti noi siamo convinti che però se l'architettura mette al primo posto uno dei suoi componenti, come questo, non ci sarà più bisogno degli architetti, perché c'è sempre qualcuno che saprà fare quella cosa lì meglio di noi, no? Saprà scegliere le componenti materiali meglio di noi, ci sarà un ingegnere che sa fare quello. Quindi noi, e su questo io am completely with Peter, cerchiamo di difendere un ambito che in the core of the thing, che è l'ambito del pensiero che l'architettura deve trasmettere nel disegno. Poi chi fa un progetto pensa agli abitanti, pensa a com'è la psicologia di un abitante, pensa ai suoi bisogni materiali, fisici, climatologici e mette insieme tutto questo dentro un pensiero. Questo penso lo difenderemo as long as we can.
Thinking about the concept of close reading, when I studied your book on Palladio, your book on Casa del Fascio, Casa Giuliani Frigerio, your book on 10 Canonical Buildings, I found a common divisor, a common thing, the use of axonometric projection. Why does close reading need axonometric projection, and or maybe why is axon the best way for you to read Terragni, to read Palladio?
First of all, I think it's really important to make the distinction between perspective and axonometric. Perspective is the way the human eye perceives something, and you can make a computer rendering of perspectives, etc. But it doesn't allow you to understand the object. You can understand the subjective experience, and we use those kinds of things all the time. But to understand what is the nature of the object that the human eye is going to be seeing, you need to put an abstract kind of drawing. One of the drawings, I think, that Choisy, the French 19th century theoretician, and Jim Sterling, the 20th century architect, used or worm's eye axonometrics, which show you the plan from below and the volumetrics at the same time, which I think are stunning. I've never really used them because I don't think from below. I think, as it were, from above. But I think there's an enormous difference between perspectival view and axonometric view. John Haydock, another important, I think, 20th century architect, used the flattened frontal axonometrics, which is another way. I think the problem with axonometric is always you're dealing with 30-90 or a certain angle, which is not the way conceptually one thinks necessarily of architecture. Most of the times we're thinking of it as a frontal experience. I mean, I'm facing this audience like this. If I were standing over there lecturing, I would be seeing it from a 45, let's say. I think it's not the way to think architecture. So I think the axonometric is a limited form of what we have, but I think it's more accurate in terms of the thing itself, the object, than the perspectival view.
Has this anything to do with Has this anything to do with abstraction?
No, come on, abstraction. What do you know? I'm going to pin you on this. I'm not dealing with modernism. I'm not dealing with any longer with the 5 points of Le Corbusier, the abstraction. Architecture is in itself an abstraction. It just is. Look at this space. This space is an abstraction that can be recorded, etc. So I don't think it has anything to do with abstraction. But go ahead.
Hello. I think that in your case it has not to do with abstraction, but it has to do with autonomy. It means in terms of autonomy from the context. And
you don't think we were dealing with the context in Istanbul?
About this point, no, let me finish the question.
Please, okay.
About this point, the Topic Happy project in Istanbul, you showed us how conceptual aspect of the concept means the A, B, C, D, etc., like in a poem, succession of Hagia Sophia or the wall they're presenting were influencing the conceptual construction of the project. But if you are looking for an autonomy in architecture, why do you care about the succession of Hagia Sophia or the wall existing? Why don't you choose them autonomously?
Because if you're always faced with a blank sheet of paper, no matter who you are in this room, you're starting to work, right? And I've always felt as a rationalist, as opposed to an experienced person who's interested in the effects of light and shadow. I mean, I was with my buddy Kurt Foster, who I always thought was an abstractionist, and he was talking about the mist coming through the church of San Andrea in November and what it's like to be in that fog that comes through the church. I think, holy Jesus, you can't design the fog, but you can think some sort of organizational autonomy, let's say. And that autonomy can come from the site, it can come from any number of, it can come from a 4-square grid, it can come from a 9-square. We wanted to find an organizing principle that could move along the 200 meters, because we're talking about a 200-meter length building, and to do a 4-square building, boom, 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 boom. We would be repeating the same. So we had to find a meter I wanted to deal with the scale of 200-meter long building. That just wasn't. So we found a a meter in it didn't have to be Hagia Sophia. It could have been in Katsura Palace in Japan. We found a meter that worked to differentiate from 10 meters, 50 meters, 100 meters, etc. At different scales. We could find an intonation. And that gave us something that I felt we could begin with. It wasn't to be contextual. I didn't give a damn if it was Hagia Sophia. It would help when we spoke with the mayor and we said, hey, Mr. Mayor, look at this. This comes from Hagia Sophia as opposed to coming from Syria, okay? And so Mr. Mayor likes that. So why not? Why shouldn't he? So if we can accommodate the mayor and accommodate ourselves at the same time, why should anybody complain?
That's a pragmatic. I want to add one thing. I want to add one thing to this. Yes. I think when I was speaking of abstraction, I was not speaking of Eisenman.
Okay.
I was speaking of the fortune of axonometry in the history of 20th century. Regarding this, my point of view, that Peter may disagree, is that in most of the best Eisenman's project, there is a quite personal, autonomous, I don't like this word, but anyway, autonomous way of building a relationship with memory. No, I think Peter's rebuilds history every time he designs a building. So the presence of these fragments, of these grids in the Istanbul project for me is also coming from this, from his need to rereading history within his projects.
I think people raise a good point. I didn't use the word memory, but the thing that distinguishes what anybody here does and a computer has no memory. In other words, when you start with a computer and you start with a grid, it isn't a memory of a grid, it's just an abstract thing. And how do you start on a computer? You start with a ball that's gridded, let's say, and you start chopping away to produce something that deals with gravity or structure or whatever. The computer isn't a design tool for me. It is an analytic tool that takes things and allows you to look at them. And when I watch students, especially who are working in my office, sitting with the computer and the thing is spinning around, you have to watch students do this, and you say to yourself, what the hell are they doing? You know, what are they seeing? And to me, the difference is that we all, whether we like it or not, have a memory. The things that we produce have memories, and we have to be able to deal with those. So I think that my work has always dealt with memory, whether it's the Cannaregio project, whether it's the Wexner Center project, whether it's the Holocaust Memorial. It deals with, at least in the Holocaust project, working against memory. That's one of the things that the alternate right don't like. That is, it stands outside of the memory machine of the Holocaust, and it becomes more difficult for them to deal with. So I'm glad people brought it up, and I absolutely think that memory is what distinguishes the work that we as architects produce from the computer.
So, if I'm not wrong, we can consider architecture both an epiphany of the present and a trace of the past. What do you mean for innovation in your practice, and what would you consider to be the most innovative of your works? We are talking about both past and present in your works. So, what do you think is innovation in your practice? And what would you consider to be the most innovative of your projects?
Well, first of all, you asked me a very interesting question. What is the most innovative thing in your project? I'm trying to work out what my project is. I thought she said project. Practice? Okay. Well, I still think I'm trying to work out what my project is. As far as practice is concerned, I don't know if I practice. But the thing is, innovation is not something that I ever was, I don't think, dealing with. I don't think my practice is innovative, and I'm not sure that innovative makes it good or bad. So I'm here today speaking to a group of Italian people interested in architecture, not because I'm an architectural innovator, okay? So then you ask, well, what are we here for? And I think that's a real question. But
But that's me that has to answer.
No, but I don't think it's to do with innovation.
No, of course.
Nobody's here because I'm an innovator. I'm not Buckminster Fuller. I'm not Einstein. But I have interesting ideas about, and I've had a life of architecture that I try and share at every moment that I'm doing this, whether it's through writing, teaching, or lecturing and building. When I go to a church like San Biagio yesterday,
Yeah.
I don't listen to what they say about the history of San Biagio, etc. I sit and look at San Biagio, and I read San Biagio, and I stay for an hour inside and outside reading the building. That's what I want people to do. That's what I do to my buildings. I think it's important to do that. But it's nothing, San Biagio, I don't know what's innovative about San Biagio. I don't care. What I like is that slot of space between the bell tower and the side aisle. It's amazing, that space. Boy, oh boy.
Well, I have to say that I agree. I think that architects get lost if they look for innovation in itself. On the other hand, at the cost of making me angry, I have to say that Peter Eisenman has been tremendously innovative in his career a number of times, but maybe not in the sense that we are overwhelmed by technology today, by structure. Maybe he was innovative in the way he read Terragni, in the way he read Palladio, in the way he's reading San Biagio now, and in how this had impact in his teaching, in his practice, in his thinking. So maybe we have to deal with a more sophisticated concept of innovation. But I think you're never innovative when you try to be innovative. This is sure, I think.
I'll tell you what we're doing in my design studio and in my office. We're dealing with a term that I didn't use today called lateness. In other words, what I feel is it's a good time to be late. In other words, not innovative, not early, not of the moment, but late. And if I could understand what late meant, I understand what it is in music, I understand what it is in literature, I understand what it is in painting. I'm trying to understand what it is in architecture so that I can do it.
But then when you're very, very late, you become fashionable, you know.
Yeah. So I have to say that if I were leaving you with one word tonight, it would be late.
Be late.
Be late. Yeah, be late. Be outside the zeitgeist, and I think that's it.
Cool.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Ultima domanda, io sono un tecnico, un architetto dell'entroterra. Volevo fare al maestro Eisenman questa domanda in riferimento a tutto quello che ci ha detto. Ci Lei sa benissimo, abbiamo delle aree colpite dal sisma. Il maestro Eisenman come interverrebbe all'interno dei centri storici attuali devastati come Amatrice, Camerino, eccetera? Che rapporto, cosa ci consiglierebbe e cosa farebbe il maestro Eisenman? Grazie.
You know, this area, I mean, it's our fault we didn't speak about this to you before. You know, all this area has been hit by a very complicated earthquake. And this is a much more complicated earthquake than usual earthquake because it hits like medieval, early Renaissance centers where there were like 4, 10, 15 families. You don't know if you have to rebuild. You have to know how you have to rebuild. Sometimes there is a church, which is beautiful, but what would you do with the rest? So do you have an idea about, I know this is a very brutal question because you haven't been on the area. You never, I think, you work on the earthquake in a very sophisticated way in Tokyo many years ago. But do you have any advice for this? A lot of people here who has to deal with this extremely complicated problem.
I think that's a really good question. My answer is, I believe in expertise, okay? And I don't think people who read Peter Sloterdijk are experts at dealing with earthquakes. I don't think that people who listen to Peter Eisenman are experts at dealing with earthquakes. I think there are experts out there that could help all of us to deal with those problems, and if they're not, we need to invent those people. So I've always been a person that limits what I think I know and what I talk about to my own expertise. What is my expertise? I see differently than a lot of people, okay? I've learned how to see. In fact, the first trip that I came to Italy with Colin Rowe in '61, I was a noble savage, as he says. I was an uneducated American, okay? And the first day I was in Italy, we were in Montagnana, and we were looking at a Palladian villa. I'd never seen a Palladian villa. So Colin Rowe sits down and has, at a bar, and has an aranciata or something. And he says, Peter, you go out there and stand in front of that facade in 35-degree heat and tell me, you can come back, and when you can tell me something that you cannot see. And I thought, what the hell is he talking about? Something I cannot see, right? And he said, I don't want to know about the 3 floors. I don't want to know about the rustication. I don't want to know about the scale of the opening. I want to know about something that you cannot see. And that's when I began to learn to see as an architect. And I think teaching and becoming an architect involves learning how to see, like a composer of music learns how to hear without hearing the music, okay? And a painter learns how to look at a canvas and see something in the canvas that I can't see, okay? So therefore, when I believe there are people who know how to deal with earthquakes in the same way that I know how to deal with what can be seen, okay? And therefore, I think it's a valid question, but it's not a question that do I believe as a normal citizen we should consider the problem? Yes, but
the relation with history.
Basically, the question is, what would you, if you do, I mean, it's an old, boring Italian obsession. Do you build modern or do you build fake in historic?
No, you can't build nostalgia. I mean, you don't build what was there, you rebuild what was there. Yeah. I mean, I don't believe in rebuilding Mies van der Rohe's Barcelona pavilion. I think that's ridiculous. I think rebuilding the Schloss in Berlin, ridiculous. But we have to rebuild what's of today, whatever that means. It's certainly going to be something different than was built before. Anyway, thank you all.
That's an important conclusion. Grazie.
Pertanto, una prima considerazione, credo che possiamo dire di esserci, oltre che, come diceva Adolfo, onorati di aver ascoltato quanto Peter ci ha detto, ma di esserci arricchiti di un qualche cosa che prima non avevamo. Certo che parlare di futuro, soprattutto parlando di architettura, è qualcosa di estremamente difficile, complesso, proprio perché l'architettura è funzione di tante variabili che sono quelle del momento, quelle del contesto e quelle delle esigenze che si presentano, pertanto di volta in volta si danno le risposte. Una sola considerazione volevo fare, che forse credo sia interessante, Peter. Quando tu ci hai fatto vedere il progetto del museo, eccetera, si inserisce nel contesto di una città, che è Istanbul o Costantinopoli se volete, che per troppi anni è stata statica. Per troppi anni è stata statica. Oggi finalmente si è proceduto a dare inizio ad un processo di modernizzazione della città, e la modernizzazione parte sempre dalle infrastrutture, quindi la viabilità, quindi gli aeroporti e le stazioni, gli hub di comunicazione, e il passo immediatamente successivo che il governo turco sta facendo è proprio quello di dare spazio alla cultura con la creazione di diversi musei e integrazione dell'offerta dell'ospitalità, proprio per spingere sulla componente del PIL del paese con il turismo in questo senso. Pertanto questo volevo offrire come maggiore il ricordo di questo pomeriggio. Adolfo prima ti ha dato qualcosa di passionale, di emotivo, che era la maglietta. Noi vorremmo che tu ci lasciassi con un ricordo del design e della tecnologia. Questa ha la forma di una pizza, ma è una lampada. It's a pizza lampada.